July 1942. Somewhere in the Libyan desert, 200 miles behind Rommel's front, a standard Willys Jeep, a light American four-seater built to carry a patrol and a few crates, crawls across flat sand, carrying something its designers never intended. 5 Vickers K machine guns are bolted to improvised mounts. A dozen jerrycans of fuel and water are lashed to every surface. Ammunition drums fill the passenger space. Ropes and sand channels hang from the sides. The springs are almost flat. 3 men sit crammed between guns, fuel, and gear, navigating by sun compass across a world with no roads. It looks like a junkyard on wheels. And over the next 12 months, vehicles just like this will burn hundreds of Axis aircraft on the ground, far more than their tiny numbers should have allowed. This is the story of the SAS armed Jeep, the weapon that proved a handful of men in a modified car could do the work of a bomber raid at a fraction of the cost and with almost no aircraft losses of their own. To understand why someone thought to bolt aircraft guns to a Jeep, you have to understand what Britain was losing. By mid-1942, the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica often enjoyed local air superiority over the desert. Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Ju-52 transports struck supply columns with impunity. Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters prowled the skies and stripped Allied air cover from contested areas. Every RAF fighter destroyed meant pilots and machines Britain could not easily replace. High-altitude bombing of dispersed desert airstrips was expensive, inaccurate, and wasteful. Aircraft parked on open sand across miles of ground were simply poor targets for conventional bombers at 10,000 feet. Lieutenant David Stirling, a Scots Guards officer recovering from a parachute accident, proposed a different calculus in July 1941. What if small, highly trained teams could be put behind enemy lines to walk onto poorly guarded desert airfields at night and destroy aircraft by hand-placed charges? With General Claude Auchinleck's approval, Stirling formed L Detachment, the Special Air Service, a deliberately misleading name meant to suggest a larger airborne formation. The idea was audacious in its simplicity. Use stealth and demolition to remove the enemy's ability to fight from the rear. The first test, Operation Squatter, November 1941, was a disaster. A sandstorm scattered parachutists across the featureless desert. Containers of explosives were lost or soaked. Of 50-odd men who jumped, only a fraction returned. The verdict was harsh. Parachuting into the western desert was too risky. Foot raids had failed at unacceptable cost. Rescue came from another desert innovation, vehicle insertion. The Long-Range Desert Group, already expert in navigation and long-range travel, offered to carry SAS teams on road-borne raids. Suddenly, the problem changed. Vehicles could traverse hundreds of miles and put men at airfields without the hazards of parachute drops. In December 1941, a patrol led by Lieutenant Paddy Mayne struck Tamet Airfield using a new weapon developed by Lieutenant Jock Lewis, the Lewis bomb. Lewis's device was elegant and deadly simple. Each charge combined roughly 1 pound of Nobel 808 plastic explosive with a small thermite component and a bit of fuel, lightweight, stable, and devastating to aircraft. A single man could carry a dozen charges, a team could leave dozens of craters, set fires in fuel tanks, and turn parked planes into burning wrecks. On Tamet that night, the method worked. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed with no SAS casualties. The formula proved repeatable. But the enemy adapted. Sentries and lights began to ring desert airstrips. Silent infiltration became costly. The SAS needed a way to bring the same destructive power in minutes rather than hours, and to do so with the relative protection and speed only a vehicle could provide. The armed Jeep was the answer. Beginning in mid-1942, Sterling's men standardized on the Willys MB Jeep. The baseline vehicle was simple, a 60-horsepower flathead 4-wheel drive with a 2-speed transfer case and a road speed up to 65 miles per hour. What the SAS did to it was anything but simple. The defining modification was the Vickers K machine gun, an aircraft-designed weapon firing .303 British at a blistering 950 to 1,200 rounds per minute from 100-round Pan magazines. Sterling and his sergeants reasoned that a gun built to defend bombers in the air would be perfect for shredding airplanes on the ground. They harvested K-guns from scrapped RAF aircraft and mounted them on swivel pedestals and improvised pintles. Typical configurations carried 3 to 5 Vickers K-guns. Some Jeeps even mounted a .50 caliber Browning for anti-armor work.
The Jeeps were modified for desert survival as ruthlessly as they were for firepower. Windscreens were removed to prevent glare and to reduce the silhouette against the sky. Radiators were chopped and enlarged to keep motors cool at road speeds in 45-degree centigrade heat. Condensers and radiator water recovery systems, innovations pioneered by the LRDG's Ralph Bagnold, kept engines running hours longer. A Bagnold sun compass gave true bearings unaffected by engine interference. Every surface carried jerry cans, fuel for the engine, water for men, and spare petrol for the return leg. Fully loaded, an SAS Raider Jeep could weigh up to twice its factory gross weight, yet the compact 4-wheel base and nimble steering let it weave between rows of parked aircraft with a truck's impossibility. Night navigation demanded an almost occult art. Columns of Jeeps crossed the featureless desert by dead reckoning, sun compass, and celestial sightings. Radio silence was enforced. The approach was timed to desert darkness. Flares were rarely used except as signals. Then, at the appointed moment, a flare would go up, engines would fall silent, and the Jeeps would crash through the perimeter wire in a screaming V formation. The proof of concept came on the night of 26th to 27th July 1942 at Sidi Hanish Airfield. 18 Jeeps with about 60 SAS men, guided by LRDG navigators, crossed 50 miles of desert without headlights. As the column closed, the runway lights inadvertently came up for an incoming Luftwaffe aircraft, illuminating every parked plane. Sterling, or his lieutenants on the ground, signaled the attack. The Jeeps sliced into the field in formation. Gunners poured molten lead and incendiary tracer into fuel tanks and cockpits. Thermite and pre-placed charges finished what the guns began. Accounts vary, and wartime claims were often optimistic, but contemporary war diaries and post-war research credit the assault with destroying dozens of aircraft in a raid that lasted roughly 15 minutes. The SAS lost 1 man in the action, and a handful were casualties on withdrawal. The material tally in bruising effect was enormous. Across the following months, the pattern repeated. Teams struck Benina near Benghazi, Tamet, Bagush, and other airstrips. They combined Lewis bombs, incendiaries, and concentrated K-gun fire to make whole fighter and transport squadrons vanish overnight.
Exact totals are disputed. Post-war analyses differ depending on Axis records and confirmation rates, but careful estimates suggest SAS and Allied Special Forces raids destroyed between 200 and 400 Axis airplanes across North Africa, with the SAS accounting for the majority of those losses. Even allowing for overclaiming, the results were strategically disproportionate. The impact was not just the aircraft lost, it was the reaction those raids forced out of Rommel's command. Airfields that had once required a single watchman now needed patrols, searchlights, defensive obstacles, and troops. Resources were diverted from frontline operations to defend rear areas. In effect, a handful of improvised Jeeps created a defensive drag on Axis logistics and shifted enemy dispositions. That multiplier effect, forcing the opponent to protect every parked plane, was as valuable as the physical kills. There were risks and limits. Overloaded Jeeps broke down. Heavy sand chewed gears and tires. A single hit could set a jerry can alight and turn a vehicle into an inferno. Drivers and gunners learned the hard price of a mistake. Leadership losses hit the SAS hard. Sterling himself was captured in 1943, but the organization endured and adapted. The Jeep raids migrated after North Africa. Jeeps and their concepts turned up behind enemy lines in Sicily, Italy, and later in occupied France, where fast, lightly armored patrols could exploit shock and speed. Crucially, no other power developed an equivalent doctrine in 1942. Germany's Brandenburgers specialized in deception and infiltration using Kübelwagen or trucks. The Americans and Soviets did not mount concentrated automatic firepower on light cars for airfield destruction in the same way. The SAS Jeeps were an original solution born of desert reality, mobility, surprise, and concentrated fire where the enemy thought himself safe. The legacy is visible in the vehicles used by special forces to this day. The SAS Jeep concept, light, fast platforms throwing heavy, flexible firepower at chosen targets, evolved into armed Land Rovers in the post-war era, into the Pink Panthers of the 1960s, and ultimately into modern long-range patrol vehicles like the Jackal and the US-built Special Operations variants that emphasize mobility over armor. The principle is the same: strike fast, strike deep, and make the enemy defend everywhere. So think back to that overloaded Willys groaning across the sand. It was a jury-rigged machine, overloaded and dangerous, but it gave a tiny specialist force the ability to do what a bomber group might do for vastly more cost and risk. 4 men, a handful of guns, one fragile vehicle, and a strategic ripple that forced the enemy to change the map. That is field invention, turning an available kit into a weapon the factory never intended and changing the logic of war in the process. If you liked this deep dive into improvised weapons and unconventional doctrine, hit subscribe. We unpack the tools and ideas that actually changed battlefields. Drop a comment with the raid you want covered next, and we'll take you there next time.